All right, so back to connective tissue. So again, not there did mention that I will kick the can slightly down the road, and now we're going to cover cartilage. So again, there are three broad categories of connective tissue: connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, including blood and lymph, and supportive connective tissue. So which of these are connective tissues? Okay, let's see how everyone did. So this is the spread of the answers. A lot of you said cartilage. Some of you said bone. A lot of you had said blood as well. Epidermis, glands, and smooth muscle. So what's correct? Well, the first three are correct. And again, so what are the four broad categories of tissue? So then we have epithelial tissue. And remember, glands are they're epithelial tissue. They're just like invaginations twisted into different shapes, like again our alveolar and our tubular and compound and simple. And then so you have epithelial tissue, you have connective tissue, you have muscle tissue, and you have nervous tissue. And again, a classic feature of muscle tissue is that contracts, and nervous tissue, that's the one that has those electrical chemical impulses. So connective tissue, it's a broad category. It's almost like when I first started thinking about it, it's like pretty much connective tissue is everything that isn't epithelial. It's not some sort of sheet or gland, or it's not muscle tissue, and it's not nervous tissue. And yes, blood is a connective tissue, and bone is a connective tissue, and cartilage is a connective tissue. All right, so supportive connective tissue. So they support soft tissues and body weight. And again, we didn't cover those that much before exam one. Why? Because we're going to cover that now. So the two big ones are cartilage and bone. And this chapter 6, I think in both books, they're devoted completely to bone tissue. So cartilage does have a ground substance. Remember, three characteristics of connective tissues. They have cells that have specific functions. They also have that matrix, right? So that has a ground substance plus those protein fibers. So cartilage does have a ground substance, and bone has a ground substance, but instead of being very fluid and gel-like, it's mineralized. It has calcium. So calcification refers to the deposition of calcium salts into that tissue. Now, the thing is that bone is very important for forming structures. Again, like your rib cage, it forms a protective cage, but not only for protection, but also supporting weight. So this is, again, depending on how much you weigh, your skeleton has to support your whole weight as you walk and you stand upright, right? And then cartilage, a big function of that is shock absorption. So as you move around, your bones are moving and the different parts of your tissues are moving. What prevents your bones from grinding against each other as they move around? And it also protects as well. And not only protects bones, but you do have cartilage that not only forms joint, but also forms some sort of like structures as well. So cartilage is a connective tissue. Most of you got that correct. So it involves, again, connective tissues. They not only have matrix, they have specialized cells. They have an extracellular matrix, and again, your books refer to as just matrix, but I like saying extracellular matrix because it means it's outside of the cells. So when you have specialized cells plus a matrix, you have the connective tissue. So I like to draw this analogy. So these are living people, right? So they're specialized cells, they're living parts. Remember, cells are living. But in a hospital, is it just the people? It's also the equipment and the structure of the hospital itself, right? So the extracellular matrix, that's all the surroundings and equipment. Now, can the equipment function by itself? No, it needs the cells, right? So the connective tissue is both not only the extracellular matrix, but also the cells that actually carry out the function that the tissue actually carries out. So it's both living parts and the parts that are outside of the living cells that work together to carry out the functions of a connective tissue. Again, are the hospital beds living? Are the walls living? Are all the IVs living? No, but you do have all these living cells that help to use this equipment and surroundings to make the overall tissue work. But what are the cells and extracellular matrix of cartilage? Since it's connective tissue, it must have cells and ECM. Well, cartilage cells. So this is an important key word and root word. Chondro or chond means cartilage. Whenever you see this, it pretty much always refers to cartilage. So it's a very useful term. So when you have chondrocytes, again, cyte, that root word meaning cells. So when you have chondrocyte, that's literally cartilage cells. So again, this is why you're able to add new vocabulary very easily if you know these root words. So chondrocytes, these are the ones that secrete cartilage extracellular matrix. Okay, so remember extracellular, again, extra meaning outside. So again, this does not include the cells themselves. The cells are important for connective tissue, but the matrix is the stuff outside of the cells. So stuff isn't living. Whereas trapped gases, that was something random I just added. Okay. All right, so extracellular matrix, and again, the two classic components in most connective tissues are your protein fibers plus your ground substance. Again, the analogy I use is like the rebar and cement, and that makes a solid foundation. But remember, the foundation itself is not living. It's the people who work on it in that building that are the living components of a building, right? So you have fibers plus something that's not quite solid, but still has some body to it. That's the ground substance, and that makes a matrix or extracellular matrix. Again, not not that cells aren't important, but this is the non-living part that forms the structural part of a connective tissue. All right, so there are three broad categories of cartilage. So these are the ones in the Martini version. Don't worry, I'll upload the slides. I know I haven't uploaded yet. So what's the cartilage extracellular matrix? So again, we know chondrocytes, they secrete it, but the thing is that they have both types of fibers, or actually like both categories of fibers. They have collagen fibers. Again, both are very strong. Collagen is a little stronger, but elastin is the one that's allowed to stretch and distort. And then you have things called chondroitin sulfates. Now, you don't have to know the exact, I'm not going to show you a picture of a chondroitin sulfate and ask you to say, what type of chemical is this? Not really. But again, this is why I make a big deal about that root word chondro. Why? Again, it has that term chondroitin, has chondro in it. It refers to that. It is a special type of polysaccharide. Again, don't worry about, in terms of chondroitin sulfates, memorizing the structure. And then you have proteoglycans. Again, this is like it's not just protein, it's not just carbohydrates. You have protein linked to carbohydrates. And remember, another big property of carbohydrates is, in general, they attract water and water attracts them. So these are also important in adding a little more like water retention and structure and kind of thickening the extracellular matrix of cartilage. Now again, there are three main types of cartilage. So you have hyaline cartilage, and then you have elastic cartilage and fibrocartilage. So remember that, again, with extracellular matrix, you have protein fibers plus the ground substance. So what do we have with hyaline cartilage is that you have mainly collagen. And again, I'm not going to ask you things like how much percentage is collagen. Again, it depends on where, but hyaline is, in general, mainly collagen. The ground substance, or elastic cartilage, you have more elastin fibers. So this is a big difference between hyaline and elastic. They're both pretty tough, but hyaline, you have more of that tougher collagen, and elastic cartilage, you have more of those flexible elastic fibers. And then fibrocartilage, compared to hyaline cartilage and elastic, this has the highest concentration of those very strong collagen fibers. So much collagen, there's not too much, there is ground substance, but compared to the other two, fibrocartilage has the highest concentration of collagen. So this is the way I memorize it. It's like, okay, the fibrocartilage, it has fibers. That's a big clue that fibrocartilage is more on the protein fiber side than on the ground substance side. Okay, so the ground substance, again, I think it's worth knowing there are many other compounds and ions and other things you can find in hyaline cartilage, but these are the three I want you to know. And chondroitin sulfates, hyaluronic acid, and actually you can find hyaluronic acid elsewhere in your body, but it's also very important. Where does hyaline come from? Hey, same root word, right? And proteoglycans, there's not just one proteoglycan, it's a broad category, but again, it's telling you like, hey, you have chondroitin sulfate, you have hyaluronic acid, and you have all these proteoglycans that make up this ground substance. So again, hyaline cartilage is more than just one type of chemical. You have multiple chemicals working to make that kind of glassy hyaline. Now, elastic cartilage, The ground substance is actually pretty similar to hyaline cartilage, but again, what's the difference between hyaline and elastic cartilage? Well, again, if the ground substance is very similar, what's the difference here? The type of protein fibers that dominate the extracellular matrix of those cartilages. And then fibrocartilage, again, if it has a very strong protein fiber concentration or very high protein fiber concentration, that takes up real estate, so you're going to have less of that ground substance. So it's not going to be as liquidy or gel-like. This is why fibrocartilage is also the toughest. So it's the least flexible, but also the strongest cartilage in general. Okay, so this is actually from a xenopus frog, but I like it because it actually shows these little pockets. Notice that you have the epithelium here, but now you have the cartilage right here, this kind of connective tissue. But this is what you have here is a stain of this. And again, remember in the H&E stain, the nuclei of cells stain dark purple due to the presence of all that DNA and nucleic acids, right? So all of these have a little, you notice there's all these little purple dots. There's a cell in each of these pockets. So the interesting thing about cartilage is that it's avascular. So whenever you see that prefix A, that means without. So this means that cartilage typically does not have blood vessels. And why doesn't it have blood vessels? Actually, the cartilage cells, the chondrocytes, they secrete a special protein that inhibit the growth of blood vessels. But I think that's more, what is that specific protein? There is a name for it, but I think that's more a 300 level question. And then aneural, so there is no nerves. So things that about the cartilage structure, it's very, let's say it's not very conducive for, when these cells that are in their little hidey holes, they're fine. But cells that would somehow find their way into this actual cartilage matrix, they don't have such a good time because, again, you don't have blood vessels, so they don't have a lot of support unless they're actually in here. So the interesting thing about cartilage is that if there's no blood vessels, how do things get there? Well, they have to go through diffusion. So it can't be completely solid, but it is relatively less efficient at delivering oxygen and nutrients and exchanging carbon dioxide and waste compared to something that has blood vessels. But yeah, and perichondrium. So peri is a prefix that often means around or beside. So what we have is like a layer of cells that are surrounding a cartilage. So actually we will get to more about epithelia that surround connective tissues later on. Okay, so perichondrium. So again, 3 major types of cartilage. And then you have something called lacunae, or lacuna is singular, lacunae refers to more than one lacuna. So these are extracellular matrix chambers containing cells. So in the previous slides, we saw those little pockets. So each of these are a little lake. They're a little lacuna. So they're a little pocket, a little private lake for each of these chondrocytes. Now, this is how a cartilage grows. So what we have here is a cartoon we have from the Martini version of the book. But, okay, so I'm going to show you a little animation. So this is the cartilage matrix. And here we have all these little pockets. I'm showing it 2D, but they're going to be in reality 3D structures. And these are called lacuna, right? Or lacunae for multiple or plural. So again, they're referred to the same thing. And within each of these lacuna, you may have 1 or 2 and sometimes 3 of these chondrocytes. So these chondrocytes are hanging out within these little pockets in the matrix. They're not just in the matrix themselves and just like without and completely surrounded by the extracellular matrix. So the interesting thing is that these chondroblasts and chondrocytes, they can divide. And when they divide, so how do they actually get interspersed or dispersed among that extracellular matrix and cartilage? Well, say this chondrocyte or a chondroblast undergoes mitosis. So what's going to happen now? Well, it's going to now secrete new cartilage matrix. So it's going to secrete more extracellular matrix. And as it secretes matrix, that starts to solidify. So things that these chondroblasts and chondrocytes are always continually secreting new matrix. And as they secrete more matrix, what do you notice? Well, as they secrete more matrix, remember these two came from the same original cell. But as they secrete more matrix and layers of matrix inside their own little lacunae and little hidey holes, they're starting to build more and more layers between their previous partner or sister cell. So I think I like to draw this analogy. Like when I lived in the Halealoha dorms, like I got along with my roommate, but the thing is that we had our desk, or actually nobody has roommates now. But say you share your room with your brother or sister or sibling, and say you have a common desk and then or common area, but you start putting your junk in the area between on the imaginary border between you and your sibling. And what happens over time? Well, as you add more junk, it starts to form a thicker and thicker barrier, right? So that's kind of what happens between two chondrocytes that came from the same mother cell or parent cell, actually. So as they build more cartilage, they start to build more stuff between them, and this is a common thing, like misconception. These cartilage cells don't just freely swim throughout the matrix. The way they move is actually due to the buildup of these layers and layers of extracellular matrix. And as they build up these layers of extracellular matrix within their own lacunae, they start drifting further apart because they're building all that stuff between them. So more matrix layers, more secretion, you start putting more distance between one chondrocyte and its former neighbors. So again, three main types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. What's the big differences? Due to differences in that extracellular matrix we covered in the previous slides. Now, hyaline cartilage, where do you find it? So these are the ones that cover, when we get to joints, find out a lot more about hyaline cartilage, but you also find these connecting your ribs to your sternum as well. So the thing about hyaline cartilage, this is stiff and flexible, but the other thing is that in your joints, they also reduce friction between bones. If you didn't have cartilage between your bones, their bones would start to grind against each other. And again, this is why we have osteoarthritis. If the cartilage wears down, what happens? You leave the exposed bone, and then your bones start grinding against each other. So you find them in these freely movable joints we call synovial joints, rib tips, sternum, and trachea. So trachea is also your windpipe. So hyaline cartilage, it does flex. It's more flexible than bone, but not as strong as bone. And even though this is human anatomy and physiology, like sharks, they have hyaline cartilage skeletons. So why is that? Well, hyaline cartilage compared to bone is less dense, so it makes sense that cartilage, like sharks, would have something less dense but still stiff and able to form their skeleton, so that they can spend less energy swimming around in the ocean. And I think, now I'm no zoologist, but I think I remember that cartilage, or not cartilage, but sharks don't stop swimming or something like that. Like they sleep, but they are still moving at some to keep the circulation on their gills. But again, this is okay, too much of a tangent. I have to crack open the zoology book. But yeah, hyaline cartilage, again, it does form structure. Now, elastic cartilage, I mean, I apologize if you don't have ears, but everyone has elastic cartilage to some extent, right? So this is more compared to your sterna or the hyaline cartilage that links your ribs to your sternum. This is very flexible. Not so much the lobe right here. This is actually mostly epithelial and connective tissue. But if you do this part right here, the helix of your ear, this is where you have a lot of elastic cartilage. So it's supportive but flexible and more elastic fibers. And actually, in histology, most of the time when you do a microscope slide of elastic cartilage, it kind of looks yellowish due to the elastin. That's just kind of the yellowish color. But again, that's kind of like more FYI. So you find it in your external ear and your epiglottis. And what's your epiglottis? Well, that's the little flap of cartilage that covers your trachea and windpipe. So when you're swallowing, your food and water doesn't go down the wrong hole. You want it, again, when you're eating or drinking, you want it going down your esophagus. Or have you ever like eaten or drank something so fast that it goes down goes down the wrong pipe? And you're coughing and coughing and coughing, and everyone's like looking at you like, what's wrong? Do you have coronavirus? And they're like, oh, are you okay? But yeah, the epiglottis is what makes sure that everything you eat and drink doesn't end up in your windpipe, your respiratory system, and ends up in your digestive system instead. All right, so fibrocartilage. Remember, this fibrocartilage has the highest density of those protein fibers in the extracellular matrix. Therefore, they're very solid and very strong, especially if they have a lot of collagen. So high collagen content, very strong. But the thing is that because you have all this compared to elastic cartilage, again, you can bend your ears. That's why my ears can like fit on these headphones. But the thing is that when you have a lot of collagen, it's strong but limits movement compared to elastic fibers. So the other thing is it also prevents bone-to-bone contact. Thing is that your vertebrae and your spinal column, it's not just bones. You want all these pads between that because again, if you're moving your spine all day, you don't want your vertebrae of your spinal column grinding against each other. But it also forms a very strong support to help you keep upright when you're sitting or standing. You also find it in your knee joints, and again, remember they're very tough. Your knees also do with a lot, especially if just from walking or if you're jogging or running or playing sports. You also have fibrocartilage that helps to do some shock absorption, and that's also between the pubic bones and again the disc in your spinal column. All right, so then again so that was a crash course in cartilage. Now we can finally get to bones. So again, cartilage is a gel type ground substance. Again, in fibrocartilage you don't have as much. Hyaline and elastic cartilage you have a little more. Bone is structural and sports weight, but cartilage, a big part of it is not just structure but also shock absorption as well, and it also protects your tissues. So again, this is cartilage in a nutshell. Okay, let's go to top hat. A little break from my lecture. So what type of cells secrete cartilage matrix? All right, let's see how everyone did. So most of you said chondrocytes, and most of you are correct. Again, chondro, that root word that means cartilage. And full disclosure, this is my first time using the live presentation tool, so I'm probably beta testing a lot of things for them right now without knowing it. Startups be like that. Okay, let's see how everyone did. So most of you said lacunae or lacuna. Both are correct. Again, lacunae plural, lacuna singular. So again, the cartilage itself surrounding it, yeah, that's hyaline cartilage. But yeah, that LAC, that's like thinking of them as in little lakes. Okay, so it looks like a lot of you got that. And again, if you didn't get it correct, don't worry.